Thank you so very much. I want to thank all of you who came and participated in the public hearing on the on issue number 1. I know that many of you spoke to some of the other issues, CalWork and others, mainly because there was a group here that that has to leave, and you were here all day in a rally, rallying us concerning the issues of poverty and CalWorks and a host of other issues. So thank you also very much for coming and participating in the public hearing. I think some of my colleagues have some comments. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the folks who came here to testify. I'm always very touched and moved by the stories that people tell us in these hearings, and it makes a big difference in terms of being able to see this as human beings in their faces, not just numbers that we look at from 30,000 feet in some sort of large statistical manner. I mean, we appreciate the statistics, but it really puts the human face on it to hear from you. As a transition from the panel and the testimony and going into the conversation of CalWorks, I just wanted to lend the perspective that I think there's so much irony in the reductions that were made to CalWorks during our budget crisis and deficit that we've been through, in that CalWorks was a reform that was created to both generate self-sufficiency and opportunity by providing services to people in poverty so that they could get on their feet and help themselves up, and also to save the taxpayers money by helping people to get off. And it succeeded in many, many respects. I mean, it's never perfect, but certainly the number of people dependent on government aid dramatically declined as a result of CalWorks. Now, it's debatable whether the jobs they got were more economically sustaining of the family than they were when they were getting a CalWorks check, but nonetheless, they had at least the opportunity to find that bottom rung and maybe begin to climb the ladder. So what we did was we took and, instead of looking at the program in that light of what it was transformed into in the 1990s, in the budget crisis, we looked at it as just another cost that had to be reduced. And I think that was fundamentally forgetful of history and what the program was designed to do. We're not out of that hole, and we've got a lot of difficulties and a lot of other things that have been dismantled too. So there's no easy road to getting it back to where it was. But I just think it's important for us to at least begin by acknowledging that it was not a program to foster government dependency, but rather a program to help people reduce their dependency on government programs by giving them the tools they need to get education and training and child care in order to find a pathway out of poverty.
Thank you very much. We will now go to issue number 2, which is CalWorks, and a budget review of CalWorks. I want to invite the panelists, who are Mr. Will Lightbourne, who's the director, and Todd Bland, the deputy director of Welfare to Work division here at the Department of Social Services, Mike Harold, who's the advocate for Western Center on Law and Poverty, Frank Mecca, who is executive director of the County Welfare Directors Association of California, and Ryan Woolsey, who is the legislative analyst, who's a member of the Legislative Analyst Office. So I want to welcome you all here to the Section 2, to the discussion of something very, very important called CalWorks. We've heard a lot of responses from the audience, many of them having to leave because of the transportation issue, but want to make sure that we give some adequate conversation to this very, very important program called CalWorks. Okay? We'll begin. Mr. Lightbourne.
Thank you, Chair Weber and committee members, and also thank you to the public who testified on issues of poverty. I don't think it's a topic we can ever talk about too much. It is a struggle we have to keep engaging. Certainly the distortions that have occurred in our economy over the past 30, 40 years have left a heavy burden on many communities. As you know, over the past year, a number of policy initiatives have been implemented to try to address the impacts of poverty or address inequality, including changes to the state minimum wage, the local control funding formula to improve educational outcomes in local communities with high numbers of low-income children, second language learners, and foster kids. And in the context of the CalWorks program, setting aside a sub-account within realignment funds to dedicate a source to grant increases, the first one of which will actually take place at the end of this week. And my gratitude to the legislature as well as colleagues in the administration for having made that possible. The governor's proposed 2014-2015 budget in this area includes several areas I want to highlight quickly. And after I do that, Mr. Bland will brief in detail. As you know, last year we proposed additional front-end services to strengthen the CalWORKs engagement. And those were developed in dialogue with our colleagues in the counties and legislative staff. This year, they're in startup mode this year, and the budget fully annualizes them for next year. These, of course, are the increased assessment tool, the expansion of enhanced subsidized employment, and the family stabilization component. Earlier today, we saw the budget memo from our colleagues at CWDA on family stabilization. We haven't had a chance to sit down with them and go through it, so I won't comment in detail on that at this point. Additionally, the budget proposes a 3-year pilot demonstration parent-child engagement project to be developed with up to 6 interested counties to address the needs of high-barrier families, either in sanction status or who are having a difficult time engaging with young children. Our intent is to work with the interested counties to identify the ways in which this program will be integrated with their welfare-to-work strategies. And it could take a number of paths, including leading to subsidized employment or other opportunities. But we see it as a way to strengthen all aspects of the program. Mr. Chesbrough, observed just before that the purposes of CalWORKs included self-sufficiency and potentially public savings. It was also a child well-being program, and it was sort of one of the 4 purposes of TANF. And within CalWORKs, one of the reasons why our state, as a matter of policy, chose to maintain a child-only caseload, regardless of the eligibility or participation of the parents, was in that recognition of the compelling interest of the state. And we see this as consistent with that. So that the research has been very clear as to the advantages that a focus on educational stimulation can have for very young kids, and our expectation is that what we can demonstrate is that it has an equal effect in helping people to connect with aspects of the Welfare to Work program. So our hope is that there will be interest in our demonstrating this on a pilot basis and seeing what we can prove. Happy to answer any questions later in the agenda. And with that, I will turn it to my colleague, Mr. Bland.
Good afternoon, Chairman Weber. Todd Bland with the Department of Social Services. I am going to work from the handout that you were given. It's a fairly long handout. I'm not going to go through all of it. Some of it is actually designed around answering some of the questions that you have on page 11 of your agenda. So I'm going to sort of stop before we get there, and I'm just going to touch on different pieces of the handout, as I was asked to give about a 5 to 10 minute overview, and I will try to stick to that time. As the first page indicates, CalWORKs is our version of the Federal Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. It serves 560,000 families with over 1 million children. Children remain eligible for assistance up to age 18. However, adults are limited to essentially 4 years of assistance. As the paper indicates, California, in part because we have our safety net for the children.
Can I just say, if you're going to say 4 years, you have to say soon to be 2, right?
We'll be discussing the 24-month
I just wanted to
welfare to work clock.
Add that asterisk after you saying that it's 4 years. So,
with respect to child poverty, compared to other states, California serves approximately 50% of the children in poverty. That would be under the prior poverty measure, not the more sophisticated one that was discussed earlier today. While 50% is less than what we would like it to be, we'd like to be able to serve more children. It is substantially greater than the nation as a whole, which averages to more like 20%. The rest of the first page does show some of the key features of CalWORKs, that it's a system of cash grants and income maintenance, but also welfare to work services to help people transition to self-sufficiency. On the next page, I have a very high-level look at the budget for you. Essentially, I think of the CalWORKs program, although there are other funds that go for things such as funding for the Student Aid Commission, the budget that sort of serves the main caseload is the $5.3 billion that's displayed at a high level for you on page 3 of the handout. We also have a breakdown of the caseload for your reference here, that essentially we have cases that are essentially subject to the welfare to work participation. Those are cases that have able-bodied adults that don't meet one of the exemptions. We show the fairly substantial amount of cases that do have some type of exemption. The young child exemption, we'll talk about that more in a moment. That was essentially something that came out of the harder budget times that were referenced a moment ago by Mr. Chesbrough and others. We also have cases that are in the sanction status, and in total, the welfare to work caseload, the cases that theoretically have adults that could work once an exemption may end, or if it can end, it's about 283,000, about half the caseload. The other half of the caseload is essentially child-only cases where there is no aided adult, and finally the safety net caseload. Essentially, those are the children where the parents have essentially reached the end of the 4 years. I'll turn, essentially your next couple of pages review some of the history. I believe some of your other witnesses are going to talk about that. I'll just say a few things. As Mr. Lightbourne indicated, new for the 14-15 budget is our proposal for the parent-child engagement demonstration pilot. It's a critical intervention that really we believe could help vulnerable families, families either in sanction or at risk of sanction, by providing essentially a two-generation approach. We would both be intervening with the parents and with the children, with quality child care, with the parents in the form of engagement in the child care setting, and then trying to build around that time in the child care setting additional time to get to usually the 20 hours participation requirement so we can cure the sanction, bring more income to the family. This is agendized later, so I won't spend a whole lot of time right now on the parent-child engagement. As Mr. Director Lightbourne said at the top, we'll be continuing the implementation of our new early engagement investments of the online appraisal tool, and again, I'll talk more about that in a moment, the expanded subsidized employment and the family stabilization. Towards the bottom of the page, you do see the other changes we're implementing this year, including the 5% grant increase that goes into effect on March 1st. We also increased the vehicle asset limit, in fall of 13, we actually implemented semi-annual reporting to essentially make it easier for recipients to report semi-annually instead of quarterly, unless they pass through certain mid-period thresholds, which would require a report. We think that's both a workload savings, workload reduction, and will allow the clients to more easily be in the program. We also will be implementing under current law at the end of this fiscal year the Work Incentive Nutritional Supplement, or WINS. That's a key component of WPR. And I didn't really talk about that, so I'll just step back. As CalWORKs is our version of the federal TANF program. The federal TANF program is a system of block grants to states to provide, among other things, income maintenance to families with children. But it also puts work requirements on the states and indirectly on the individuals. States that don't meet the overall participation rates are subject to penalties. So the work component is an important component. On the next page, on page 5, is a little bit of the history. I'm going to talk a lot about CalWORKs refocusing in a moment, so I won't spend much time there. On the historical changes that we listed below, those had been talked about earlier. There were substantial grant reductions of 4% and then 8% at different points in the history. Another major savings essentially during the budget crisis was the decision to essentially reduce the single allocation funding available to our counties by $375 million, essentially reducing their block grant resources. To make that work, because they had less money, to serve less folks, we came up with the system of the expanded exemptions for young children, essentially 2 children under age 6 or 1 child under age 2. Your next page is just sort of a handy reference table. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but it sort of shows the numbers behind some of the things we talked about. If you follow, for example, the MAP column, that's maximum made payment for the assistance unit. We're using a lot of acronyms here, and I apologize, for a family of 3. In Region 1, you can see in 2009-10, you can see the 4% grant reduction from 723 to 694, and then you can see the further reduction of 8% that occurred in 11-12. Then down below, you can see below the line, effective next week, you'll see the increase of 5%. Over on the right-hand side are actually the federal benefit levels or the allotments for a similar size family of 3 set in the federally the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. Of course, we call it CalFresh in California. You can sort of see both the good news and the bad news. The good news was under the Recovery Act legislation in 2009, there was a substantial increase in the benefits. That's the increase from the 463 to the 526. However, that came to an end, and Congress, in fact, ended it a little bit early in November, and that's why it went down. On the next page, on page 7, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the refocusing that we did and about the 2-year time limit that Mr. Chesbro just mentioned. In 2012, we refocused the program of CalWORKs on the first 2 years. Our goal was to essentially create a flexible time period during the first 2 years of assistance where families and parents would have the greatest choice of activities to participate in, whatever might make them self-sufficient, whether that's a work-focused approach or an education-focused approach. After the 24 months, it's not a time limit, it's a change in the participation mandate. At that point, they need to meet the federal requirements. But there were other changes that we made along with that. We used to have a blanket requirement that all single-parent families, regardless of the age of the children, had a 32-hour weekly participation requirement. If they didn't meet that, they were theoretically subject to sanction. That was above the federal standard, which was 20 hours for child under 6 and 30 hours with the child over age 6. We aligned to those in that year, and I'll have another exhibit that goes into some details about that. Then in 2013, we built on this. We built on the refocusing by adding the significant early engagement processes of essentially the online CalWORKs appraisal tool, and I'm going to give you a detailed status report on that in a moment. The family stabilization, designed to essentially recognize that there are some families, many families, that come through our door in our diverse caseload. They may be facing a crisis. They may not otherwise meet an exemption. If they did, of course, would be exempt from participation, but they might not have an exemption, but they're still facing a crisis, such as potentially homelessness, dealing potentially with a child welfare situation, or maybe dealing with other issues. And what we want to do is maximize the effectiveness of the 24-month period of that flexibility, and we want to address those crisis situations at the beginning. That was the idea of family stabilization. And then the other major pillar of what we did last year was the expanded subsidized employment. Essentially, we provided funding to ramp up to an additional 8,250 subsidized employment slots to be provided by the counties. I won't go into the accountability and reporting. I think you have some questions about that later, and I have some more detailed pages that deal with that. I will go on to the next page, on page 8. Lot here going on with the chart, but I just really do want to talk a little bit more about in detail about what really happened in terms of the change. If you look at in the column called prior law in the well, before we do that, maybe we should say aid to the adult and aid to the child. Essentially, one thing that we did not change is the aid to the child line. California has a safety net for children regardless of the situation of the parents, and that continues. With respect to the adult, under prior law, parents had to meet the requirements. There were higher requirements of 32 hours of participation, 20 of those core meaning more work-like approaches such as actual employment, subsidized employment, community service, or other activities like that. With the change we made, we reduced those to 20 and 30 hours respectively, depending on the age of the child. And then after 24 months, that is when essentially the core, non-core comes back in. Those are federal requirements. Again, we do face the possibility of federal penalties if we don't meet the federal work participation rate. We're trying to do everything we can to get the families ready to meet that after 2 years. I'd further point out that an education-focused client, a client chose to go to school, the 12 months of education are federally countable, so that would count as a full year before you would even move on into the flexible 2-year period, which would be 2 more years on top of that. Childcare and supportive services are available regardless of where the client is in the process, with one slight exception. That's a footnote on the basically after 48 months, when the adult is removed, supportive services are at county option. However, childcare continues. The 24-month clock, moving to the next page, does have a system in statute of extensions. We have issued guidance essentially following the statute that allows for essentially a target of 20% of essentially of clients could be extended past the 24 months. The whole idea of the extensions is if a client is making progress, a client is about to perhaps attain an educational goal, find that job, make that change, we don't want to trip the client up. 20% is the statutory allowance for that. The process of essentially implementing the 24-month clock is shown there with respect to automation. The C4 consortium essentially automated that within their system in July of 13. CalWIN is coming up just this very month. The LEADER consortium has not brought that up. So prior to it being in their automated systems, essentially counties had to keep track manually. It's now in their automated systems. But essentially the process by which it's being brought up into the state overall system, which is called Welfare Data Tracking Implementation Project, or WID-TIP, that is a slower process. But the little table we've produced for you does show that essentially in the counties for which we have the automation, as of December 2013, 18,000 actually had their clocks ticking in that month. Unfortunately, at this time, we at the state cannot query that. I couldn't tell you how many of those 18,000 have had them, say, ticking for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. I can stop now because a lot of the rest of the handout provides more detailed information, some of it directly in response to the questions you have on page 11. Be happy to do questions now, wait, or turn it over to the other panel members.
Thank you, Madam.
I am here, ma'am.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Frank Mecca, Executive Director of the County Welfare Directors Association. My very first opportunity to testify before you, and I was a little slow on the draw. I assure you it won't happen again.
It's late in the day.
Thank you. On behalf of the 58 County Human Services Administrators, I want to thank you for allowing us to testify, to sort of look back just a bit on what's happened recently in the CalWorks program, from our standpoint where we are today, and some thoughts about moving forward. I'll allude to prior testimony and try not to repeat it, but I just think it's important from our member standpoint. From 2007 to roughly 2012, the confluence of 2 factors ravaged poor families in this state. The deepest recession since the Great Depression, and some of the deepest cuts to the safety net that we've seen in a generation have been incredibly difficult for our families. You know all about the recession. I think what I'd like to sort of point out today is that for many counties in the state, there still is a recession. And so as a state, you know, we are emerging from it, but we still have many places in the state with very deep recessionary situations. The unemployment rate in Fresno County is almost 13%. In Tulare County, it's 13.5%. In Colusa, it's almost 21%. The unemployment rate in Monterey is 11%. The unemployment rate in Imperial County is 22%. So as we think about sort of statewide trends and data, I think it's important to sort of think in a disaggregated way about places where large numbers of families, low-income families live, where the economic situation has not improved as much as one might think by just looking at statewide data. So during the recession, at the moment that we needed the safety net the most, one could argue had an imperative to bolster it, ironically, perhaps cruelly ironically, we did the opposite in many ways during that same period. And you've heard about many of those changes up to now. Mr. Bland alluded to the cut to welfare to work services, the single allocation cut. Just want to give you some perspective. Over almost 4 years, we cut cumulatively over $1 billion worth of welfare to work services that otherwise would have gone to families with young children to help them move from welfare to work. We estimate that roughly 150,000 families went without welfare to work services during that period. You've heard about the grant cuts. I won't repeat what's been testified to, but it is amazing that our grants in real dollars were roughly what they were 20 years ago. Not inflation-adjusted dollars, actual dollars. From my member standpoint, what we want to let you know is that we saw the effect of the grant cuts. Just to give you one data point, between July 2006 and December 2013, Los Angeles County saw a 156% increase in homelessness among CalWORKs families. 156% increase in homelessness, as evidenced by the proportion of people applying for CalWORKs homeless assistance benefits. So we saw very directly the impact of both the recession and the grant cuts. And at the same time that our clients were facing the stiffest competition ever for a limited supply of jobs, competing with people, many of whom were displaced during the recession with resumes much longer and job skills much more plentiful, we shortened the time limit from 60 months to 24 months, which was significantly concerning to our members. It left the CalWORKs program in a pretty bleak place. And we're gratified and cautiously optimistic at the recent reforms because we're hopeful that we're at least bending the curve and putting the program on a better trajectory. But we have a lot of work still to do. I think I do want to sort of commend the governor and the legislature for eliminating the policy of exempting families with very young children and funding the welfare to work services for those people and restoring the cut to the earned income disregard that occurred during that period. The grant increase that was creatively developed and adopted last year provides some measure of improvement in grants and some modest potential for growth over time. Not a lot, but some modest. I just think it's really important to point out that by historical standards, by any measure of what we think is necessary to have a minimally basic subsistence level for a family, they're still extremely low. And so it's just a reality of the program. The programmatic enhancements in the program that Mr. Bland talked about, I won't repeat. I would just like to say I believe the administration and their leadership and their collaboration with counties and stakeholders in the legislature got it right. I think the appraisal tool, the enhanced appraisal tool, the family stabilization track, and doubling down or more on subsidized employment are really important. And we appreciate, particularly the Department of Social Services, the witnesses here at the table, for their good faith sort of working with stakeholders to get it right. So where we are right now, I think it's important to underscore what Mr. Bland said, in that we're still in the process of implementing those reforms. The CalWORKs program has been whipsawed since its inception by a dizzying array of annual changes. We actually distributed to the members a handout that I will not go through, but it's 6 pages, small font, single-spaced, of changes to the CalWORKs program since its inception. That's a lot of change for large bureaucracies to manage. Now, many of those changes were good. Many of them were sponsored by my association. Many of them were bad. Many of them were reactions to what had happened in the prior year. But I think it's important to understand that this is a program that's been characterized by an unusual and an inordinate amount of annual change that we've been absorbing and endeavoring to implement as quickly as possible. But with respect to the changes that Mr. Bland talked about, we're building an infrastructure for stabilization. We're finding the employers and building the infrastructure to ramp up subsidized employment. We don't yet have the appraisal tool. The claiming mechanisms and the program instructions have been relatively recently received. And we are doing everything we can, along with the department, to implement those changes as quickly as possible. But it is important to admit that many of the families who are subject to the shortened time limit will not have the benefit of the implementation of those reforms prior to them meeting their 24-month time limit. And that is a reality of the situation that we're in today. So quickly, moving forward, we think about it in 3 ways. The first is implementing what's on the books, and we're working as hard as we possibly can to implement those changes. We also believe that we need to make targeted strategic improvements to continue to restore the safety net, while simultaneously starting to attack the problem of poverty in a systemic way, and I'll let you know sort of exactly what I mean. With respect to restoring the cuts to the safety net, we believe that while the administration has done a really good faith job of estimating the cost of implementing those changes, there is one piece that's missing, and it's an enhancement in the services that we would provide to families that are in the stabilization track. It is the expectation, it is everyone's expectation, that families that are in that track will have an above-average need for direct services to help address the crisis that they're in at the moment. And while there's funding for workers to do enhanced sort of case management, there's no funding for us to provide enhanced services to deal with homelessness or to deal with a child's health problem that Medi-Cal's not addressing, or any number of other things that cause a temporary crisis that the stabilization component was intended to address. Other improvements to the safety net. We are co-sponsoring SB 899 by Senator Mitchell, which would eliminate the maximum family grant. It's based on a faulty assumption that people on aid make family planning decisions based on the existence of the grant. Research never supported it. Research clearly indicates that the premise is false. But we do know that the impact of the maximum family grant, or the family caps, plunges children into more deep poverty. And we all know what deep poverty does to children and to families. And so we would strongly support that measure. We also are co-sponsors of SB 1029 Hancock, which is a bill that would have California opt out of an optional ban on CalWORKs and CalFresh services for people who are convicted of certain drug felonies, particularly because of corrections realignment and the Supreme Court order and the return of nonviolent offenders to the communities. We need the ability to help those people stabilize their living situations and to get services to help them support themselves. And it completely undermines the goal of corrections realignment to deny people with children who have drug felonies, who we as a matter of policy have decided need to be reinserted into the community, and then deny them the services to be successful. So we would strongly suggest that the committee take a look at that. And finally, I think it's time with the state's economy improving to systematically start looking at the core sort of the question of poverty at a systemic level. There are a number of proposals in your agenda, all worthy of consideration. I'd like to highlight a few. The first is the Earned Income Tax Credit. Research has shown that the federal Earned Income Tax Credit is one of the most, if not the most effective national anti-poverty strategies we as a nation have ever adopted. In 2012, the federal EITC lifted 6.5 million Americans out of poverty, 750,000 of whom are in California. 25 other states have adopted state Earned Income Tax Credits. We have not. And we believe that it is an extremely efficient and effective public policy for helping low-wage people get out of poverty and get far enough out of poverty that they can provide a decent standard of living for their families. We would also align ourselves with the suggestions in the agenda for a state nutritional supplement, building on the infrastructure that we already have in the SNAP program, and further enhancing the work incentive of the CalWORKs program through the Earned Income Disregard, otherwise known as the policy by which we allow people who are on aid to keep some of their earnings without docking them in their grant. So finally, I'd just like to thank you for your interest and let the administration and the legislature know that we are excited about turning the tide, and there's a lot of work to do, and we look forward to joining you in doing it.